actual practical steps in building DAOs.
I'm just going to ask Irina Heaver, aka the crypto lawyer, to join the stage, and she's going to be talking about everything about DAOs. Just going to get you a mic. There you go.
And of course, my fellow attorney, who's practicing heavily in the crypto space, Gordon Einstein, please. The actual relative of the Professor Einstein. So we will get all the wisdom and all the brains, and I'm here for the beauty, I guess. So with so many communities, let's sit in the middle. With so many communities being built right now in a decentralized manner, we're talking about GameFi projects, we're talking about metaverses, DeFi projects. The questions that we get all the time, how do we build a DAO? How do we actually do that? There's so many people out there saying that they're a decentralized autonomous organization, but what does that actually mean? I have my ideas. Gordon, what do you think, in your learned opinion, what is a DAO?
What is a DAO? Well, of course, that's two questions in one, which is what is a DAO, and then how do you get to a true DAO?
Let's first tackle what is a DAO.
Sure. So decentralized autonomous organization. It's not just a neat sounding acronym. I would argue that there's three components, so this is open to interpretation. I'll take the last one first. It's not simply a smart contract or a community or a market necessarily operating on the blockchain or elsewhere. It has to be an organization in the sense that it's a group of people or entities, obviously we were just talking about AI, that are somehow operating together over time and space in order to produce a certain outcome. Right? So it's sort of like an institution. Those words are a bit interchangeable. It's not merely a marketplace. That's not an organization. So I'd say it's a little bit more of a heavy or loaded term. I'll switch to the beginning of it, decentralized. The world history is full of centralized corporate and organizational forms, whether it's a standard corporation, a limited liability company, a partnership, an association, all the things we're sort of used to. They're usually licensed by the state, but not only. You only have to ask permission for them to exist. Decentralized implies that they don't have this sort of vertical management structure. They're not necessarily authorized by the state, and that the access to them is somewhat democratized. Again, these terms are subject to interpretation. Autonomous, I think, is the one that people tend not to focus on, and they should. Vitalik and Dan Larimer's supposition is that for an organization to be autonomous, it needs to have its own economy. It needs to be able to pay people and get paid. Unless it has that functionality and can do it without asking anyone's permission, it's not truly autonomous in any meaningful sense. So you have a decentralized, autonomous organization. That's a DAO.
So people have been pulling resources, time, and assets together to achieve a commercial outcome for centuries, right? And then it started sort of being formed into what is now known companies, corporations. Let's say 100 plus years ago, first shipping companies were being set up like this. I buy a share, you buy a share, and then we go on a voyage and hopefully make some money. Then the railway companies started in this manner. A whole bunch of people will pull resources together and build a railway and, journey into the Wild West. And at that time, it was an absolutely crazy idea that you can own a little bit of a company, I can own a little bit of the company, and then 600 of us can do that. It was a nonsense idea, right? It was a novel idea. So many people are now struggling. So many people are thinking that DAO is something so unique and so new, but that's the progress of companies. At some point, it was novel to have shares. Now it's novel to have a distributed team working on a project. When do you? But now companies. I understand a company. We all understand a company. Most of us own companies and have shares. When do you think we will get to that point where most of us will be part of a DAO or several DAOs, because you can be part of 10 DAOs, there's no limit to that. When do you think we'll get there?
So I like to tease out language. Think about what we're saying. You own a company, but you're part of a DAO. There's a fundamental paradigm shift in language when you think about it. Okay, you're part of a DAO. You own a company. It's a fundamentally different role. And you're making a great point. I think the first limited liability entity where the investors could only lose their investment and nothing more was the Dutch East Indian Company that was granted a royal charter where people could invest, the captain would sail, and the most they could lose would be their investment. It was a very clever and important evolution, because as ventures become more complex and have to operate over time and space and have scale, traditional partnerships of ways of just kind of working together and sharing the profits don't work anymore. You need to get specialization. You need to have people that are specialized in management. You need to get people that are specialized in investing, operating, all these things. And so what companies allowed us to do is to separate management from ownership and activity within the company. What we're kind of doing now is coming back a little bit to the pre-corporate model, because you're part of a DAO. That implies you're more than just cashing your checks or getting your coupons. It means you're participating in governance and in management and in actually doing some sort of activity. It's a very flexible structure. And I don't want to knock traditional legal forms. Corporations and limited liability companies and all the different international versions of these, they serve their purpose. They fueled capitalism. They allow for huge amounts of capital aggregation. But to your point, how do we get there with DAOs? In a strange way, and DAOs need to offer the same features that companies do. You need to be able to invest in a DAO and not be then liable for all your assets. Okay, because right now, if you invest in a DAO or you work in a DAO, who knows what legal form it is? If it's a general partnership, you're liable for every act of any other member of that DAO. That's dangerous. So I think what we're going to see is like a merging of law and DAO. There's another possibility, and then I'll kind of hand it back, which is, what if DAOs can exist beyond law? What if participants get protected, the rest of their assets are protected simply because you don't know who they are or what they own? That's potentially possible on the blockchain. That may be a form of, in fact, limited liability, and I think it's worth exploring.
So let's talk about actual steps, right? Because that's what we get asked all the time, how to build a DAO. I guess the first step is decide that you want to be a DAO, right? Decide that you want to build an organization where everybody takes part and you're leading the efforts till that moment in time when you can release those efforts to the community. So a DAO cannot have a CEO. A DAO cannot have other sort of C-level executives, because that's this, in my mind, that's a centralization of the power. Do you disagree?
You read my expression. I don't think, who's to say a DAO can't hire a CEO? A DAO, the whole concept that Vitalik and Dan Larimer came up with was the autonomous part. DAOs, maybe even run by AI, can hire humans rather than the other way around. Who says that one of the humans they don't hire is a CEO that serves at the pleasure of the DAO? And if you're trying to operate in the real economic space, to build roads and run power plants, one of the arguments I always get into, or discussions I always get into, is, can DAOs accomplish things in the real economy that are complex, like building and operating a dam? For that, you probably need a CEO.
Okay, fine, but I just think that those centralized titles are the opposite of the decentralized group that you're trying to build. But we can agree to disagree. And
it could be a DEO.
DEO, why not?
Decentralized executive officer.
Here's new titles being invented on the spot, for sure. So decide you want to be a decentralized organization. Have some sort of like a leadership, right, that leads the efforts until that point of time. What are the next steps? What is the next step you're going to do? So
the classic DAO conundrum is that it's very hard to launch a project initially as a DAO, because you need to get things done. Okay, and you don't necessarily want the wisdom of the crowd your first several steps. You know what you need to do often, and you have the resources often, and you have a dedicated small group often. So when these projects that aspire to be a DAO launch, they're very rarely a DAO. They're usually highly centralized. And then they go through a process called progressive decentralization, where at the edges more and more power is ceded to the community or other stakeholders. But the question is, what is that magic tipping point where the initial startup group loses or surrenders or cedes enough power such that it becomes truly decentralized? That's a critical legal issue, because that's the point maybe when the token of the DAO stops being a security under law. Okay, because remember, under the Howey test, common enterprise is one of the prongs. If something's truly decentralized, you no longer have a common enterprise.
Okay, we are not in the US, so let's also consider other
Fair enough.
jurisdictions that exist in this world. Can you imagine? There are other countries except from the US. So what is, but let's talk about what is the next step then. So let's say DAO, or whatever the centralized group for the time being, acquires the assets, because those assets need to be management. In my mind, DAO is more of a management of an assets rather than the ownership, or rather than the company per se. Do you see the difference, the management of and the ownership?
So I think the great thing about DAOs is they're ultimately flexible. Whatever you can program in Solidity or anything else is that what your DAO can do. They're actually maybe far more flexible than traditional legal forms, and we don't know their final forms. There's some economies that simply exist on-chain. They have a functionality that they offer, they have their own tokens that they're issuing, and they are self-sufficient. There's also DAOs that can operate DeFi platforms, and also DAOs that, once the oracles are set up correctly and they're legally recognized, can operate real-world economic assets. I think the question isn't, is a DAO this or this or this? It's more like a buffet. You have a little bit of this, a little bit of this, a little bit of this. Just the question, will the technology and the law allow for these things to happen?
That is a very good question. Will law allow for this to happen? And my question is, can we be at this point in time of our technological progress where the law holds us back? I mean, that's just stupid, right? Innovation is permissionless. We cannot have some regulator sitting somewhere in their dark office writing a law, and then you go build a DAO, or you go build technological advancements. Otherwise, the planes would not be built, right? Other sort of like, Bitcoin wouldn't have been launched if Satoshi was sitting and waiting for FCA to regulate it, right? So
don't ask for permission, just do it, okay? Don't commit a crime that's gonna get you in jail. Don't hurt another individual. It's like the 3 law of robotics from Asimov. Okay, but don't wait for a license, don't wait for permission, don't wait for a law. All right, it's just not worth it. Because while you're waiting and being a good little boy or girl, Uber and Airbnb are eating your lunch. And do you want to be Uber or do you want to be Lyft? Okay, because you want to be the first mover at scale. Okay, and you want to move fast and break things without ending up in jail. So with DAOs, there's a lot of this stuff is the regulators properly having their hands forced by actual technological innovation and crowd adaptation or adoption of these technologies. If Bitcoin wasn't already being massively used and the network massively scaled, the regulators would try to shut it down. But the fact it had, Bitcoin just sort of a stealth insurgency against the financial system, or to make it even better, to save it, depending on your point of view, I say DAOs are what we need to really capture the 21st century. Don't wait for like some country to come up with a law. Just do it.
And
that's not legal advice. I'm just kind of giving you a rah-rah.
And nothing we say here is legal advice. And another
all
thing,
hypothetical.
China bans Bitcoin twice a year, right? And every time they ban, the adoption happens. So maybe it's good that China starts banning DAOs. Maybe then we'll figure out, oh, fantastic, this is an excellent opportunity. Let's look more into that. All right, what other practical steps do we have today?
Well, it's getting back to that transition point between centralized and decentralized. It's so tricky, and this is universal, because once you are actually decentralized, you lose the ability for the founding group to fix it if it goes wrong. Okay, once you're decentralized past a certain point, it's gone. It's no longer your baby. That's the goal, and that's the problem. Because if you've made a mistake with your smart contracts or your setup or your governance or your incentives, you yourself will never roll them back. And what you're seeing in these decentralized communities It's called the coordination problem. It's very hard to coordinate lots of different people with varying level of involvement and investment over time, over language, over incentives. So you need to just understand that once you go fully decentralized, the ability to fix things is vastly reduced and may actually be gone. Sometimes that's a feature, like Bitcoin is fantastically stable because no one in the Bitcoin community gets along. Is that good or is it bad? You know, you can argue about both ways, but you just need to be very careful when you finally tip over to decentralization. And I think for all of the big talk about DAOs out there, really what you're seeing when you really poke is, you know, it's not a DAO when there's 3 people in charge. Okay, it's just an owl.
Absolutely. And that's what happens a lot. There's a group of very small people in charge and they're all sitting in the same office and everybody knows where their office is. So that's a great door for the regulator to knock on. And it's not a DAO, it's an owl. So with this, we leave you with a final thought. You know, when you're building a DAO, make sure you are actually truly committed, because that's one of the things I see entrepreneurs or founders have a really hard time letting go, and they're stuck in this centralized mindset. Thank you very much for being here. And
thanks, everyone.
And enjoy the GameFi stage where we talk about everything what's happening in the GameFi and the metaverses. Thank you.